some of the modeling and plans that I've been working on the last 4 years. So the title of this is Transitioning to a Low Carbon Economy, the Sustainability Investment Plan 2019 Integrated Resource Plan. So this is probably my fourth version of this plan. Like all good plans, it needs constantly updating. I have rebranded it to be called the Sustainability Investment Plan instead of a Carbon Tax and Investment Plan, because nobody seems to really like a carbon tax. So I've kind of rebranded it a little bit. So this is just a table of contents. We won't go through that because we'll be going through each slide. The slide here is a summary of what's contained within this document, and so this plan is based on least cost principles of social, environmental, and economic sustainability, meaning that we'll look at the least cost to social aspects of the transition, ensuring a just and reasonable transition, least cost to the environment, and least cost to as far as the economy goes. So this slide here is a summary of the plan, and really there's 5 main steps to this plan. And it also provides a brief summary of the results of some of the modeling. So if we look to the left, step 1, so we tax carbon. This particular model uses about $20 to $30 a ton economy-wide carbon tax, which isn't quite the way it ended up in our legislation, but it will work. Step 2, do a public investment of this money through NB Power, and that investment gets us to step 3, and this is where the sustainability piece comes in. So if we look through the top there, it'll create jobs, it'll create equity, it creates fairness for everyone. If we come out the right-hand side there, we get the environmental part of sustainability, so green energy. And you'll see a little graph there, and that's the increasing amounts of renewable energy that this plan will create. And then what I think is probably the most important part of this is the economic policy. So as we increase renewables, it will displace fuel and purchase power. Hopefully a lot of carbon first. There are some other fuels that we can displace that don't have carbon, such as Hydro-Quebec. But as we increase our renewables, it will displace that cost. And that's essentially what your return on investment would be by investing into renewables and efficiency and fuel shifting. And what this plan does is it takes that displaced cost and keeps reinvesting it as well. And that's a really powerful concept, because what ends up happening is you have an ever-increasing amount of money to invest. You look at the top left chart, you can see you get the carbon tax in one of the columns there, which is $370 million a year. You make an investment, the return on investment is $24 million a year for however long that renewable energy lasts. So the next year, you have $394 million. And you can see that will just continually grow over time. So essentially, what this will do is provide all of the capital needed to make that transition. And what's so great about it, I guess, is that we don't need to keep increasing rates to do that. It's the same money that we used to spend on fossil fuels lowers, we can use that money to keep reinvesting. This reinvesting piece is a really key component to sustainability. It's probably the most important piece to sustainability, in that if you don't keep putting stuff back, nothing is sustainable. If you own a business selling widgets, and if you don't take your revenue and buy more widgets to sell, you'll go out of business. Same as a farmer. If he doesn't keep replanting, he'll go out of business. And this is really the cornerstone of sustainability. You need to put some back. You can't just keep taking. So at the bottom, I guess if we look at the top chart on the right-hand side, look at these are the step 5 is that you continue to invest and reinvest until the transition is complete. And this modeling has two goals, which we'll talk about later. I call them Stage 1 RPS, or Renewable Portfolio Standard, and a Stage 2 Renewable Portfolio Standard. And then from the economic policy, we can see in the financial details for Stage 1, NB Power, if we invest this money, NB Power could be making $641 million per year for Stage 1, and over $1 billion a year profits for NB Power, which is our public utility. We own it. We're responsible for it. Its debt is our debt. These funds can be used to pay down debt, social programs, lower taxes, all kinds of really good things. Almost $2 billion is over 10% of our provincial budget right now, and I think the province could really use this. So that's really a summary of what we're going to go through tonight. And so the next page, this is some of the features of this plan, in which we'll dive into these things a little bit more as we go through the slides. So this plan is consistent with current legislation and policy, meaning that we don't have to change any laws to implement this plan. We just need to change our plans. The framework to do this is already implemented when the new Climate Change Act came out last April. The plan is based on the 3 pillars of sustainability: economic, social, and environmental. It applies least cost principles not only economically, but all the pillars of sustainability. It taxes the problem and invests in the solutions. Continually reinvests the income from the investments, creating a really powerful compounding effect. This compounding effect can provide all the capital needed to transition to a low-carbon economy. The compound effect is fueled with savings from displacing fossil fuels and purchase power, increased sales from fuel switching of the automotive and industrial sectors to electricity, as well as increased revenue from efficiency investments rather than efficiency subsidies. NB Power currently pays approximately $800 million per year in fuel and purchase power, and investments into renewables will displace this with an amortization expense on their books, which is actually, it's an expense, but it's free cash flow. So this can be used, this is the part that's going to grow exponentially. This is the lowest cost policy option, and it's not really dependent on the technology mix. So whatever mix we get at the end, it matters slightly, but it's essentially technology neutral. This is a fully integrated plan for all sectors in New Brunswick. Creates much needed jobs and a multi-decade construction boom in the province. It spreads the capital investments equally over time so that no one generation has to not only contribute, but also get the benefits from the construction boom. So instead of doing a whole bunch of work all at once, we can create sustainable industries over time. It focuses on the best investments first and investments that have the largest CO2 reductions first. It will stabilize our electricity rates and keep them low as possible well into the future, and is less than current business as usual rates being proposed by NB Power. So this is actually lower cost than doing nothing. It will transition NB Power to be debt-free, which we're currently about 95% in debt for all the stuff that we own. We owe 95% of that is debt. There's no early retirement for existing power plants, meaning that we don't have to worry about people losing their jobs. So instead of shutting down the fossil fuel plants, so it focuses on displacing fossil fuels, not fossil fuel capacity. Fossil fuel plants in themselves do not emit CO2, only burning fuel in them. And keeping them around for backup and reliability is relatively cheap. It's going to be a significant new source of earnings for the province without the need for rate increases. It prioritizes investments over subsidies for both the supply and the demand side of the picture. It requires minimal behavior changes and focuses on change from dirty energy to clean energy. And due to the exponential nature of this policy, it's guaranteed to work if the policy is followed. When you change any of the variables in this policy, any of the assumptions in the policy, it really only affects when we get to our objective, not if we get to our objective. So, as I said earlier, what we get created in our Climate Change Act is an exponential policy. I've had this concept, you can see the top left, reviewed by Dr. Rob Moore, and he suggested that all provinces do this. You can see just next to that, this has been extensively reviewed in front of the economic regulator, in front of the Energy Utilities Board. And there's a quote from NB Power saying that they reviewed this model and saying, you know, it's essentially correct. It could be a little bit better modeling, but what it's setting out to do, it's accomplishing. So again, this is policy. If we look to the bottom left, that's a quote from the new Climate Change Act, and I'll just show you where this reinvestment piece comes in. So this says the fund will be credited with the following amounts: the money transferred by the fund by the Minister of Finances, and that's the existing gas tax that they're repurposing. But Section C is the really important part, and we're the only province that have legislated that part of the plan, and it's really good because that creates this exponential policy. And if anybody's not sure what exponential means, shows a little graph there in the middle, and you can see the red line is an exponential policy, where the blue line is just simple interest. So you can see over time it grows faster and faster and faster and faster. This is so powerful that one of the smartest people in the whole world considered it the 8th wonder of the world. And one of the richest men in the world will tell anybody that will listen the secret to his success is compound interest. I know almost every Canadian can retire a millionaire if they start making investments in RSPs earlier in their career. It takes some time for it to work, but given enough time, almost every Canadian can retire a millionaire using this concept. So many of the other provinces have earmarked some of the carbon tax revenue to be used for carbon reductions, but most of them is in the form of subsidies, not investments. We're the only one that have got this really important piece. We have another piece of legislation called the Electricity Act that also has the potential to create a compounding effect. And you can see that in the middle bottom. And it says that NB Power should be able to earn sufficient revenue to earn a just and reasonable return in the context of the corporation's objective to earn sufficient income to achieve a capital structure of at least 20%. If those earnings are invested in renewables, it will have the same effect as our Climate Change Act. Another really important part of the Electricity Act is that it says that rates shall be kept as low as possible. This is really important because the only credible solution to climate change is the electrification of our economy. And keeping rates low is very important to facilitate that happening, as people will generally not switch to something that's more expensive. So we need to be really careful that we keep rates low, and that will really help the shift happen faster. Another really important part of our current legislation in the Electricity Act is Section 102, which states our integrated resource plan should be developed on the principles of least cost, on the principles of least cost, and on the principles of sustainability. So what I went through on the first slide is evident within our current policy. I think it's really important, as activists and governments and everybody, that public consultations is really important. We need to, whatever pathways we take, I think public consultations is really important. And New Brunswickers have said that they want clean energy and low rates. NB Power's current IRP struggles to deliver on clean energy and low rates. Fracking, nuclear pipelines are all being presented as viable options for NB against the wishes of many citizens. Coincidentally, the arguments currently being used to promote these unpopular energy projects could be used to support projects that are clean and would produce the desired low rates. The slide is an excerpt from NB Power's What Was Said report for their 2017 IRP. So there's a quote here from the Conservation Council, and it brings up a really good point. New Brunswickers want NB Power. We tried to sell it several years ago. There was essentially a referendum about it. And New Brunswickers want NB Power. We don't want it sold. We want them to generate our power. And they want reasonable rates. Conservation Council also urges NB Power to advance in an electrification strategy for its IRP that would form the basis of federal provincial negotiations on how carbon pricing revenue and infrastructure dollars could be allocated within the electricity sector. So again, this is in line with the aspects of what the Conservation Council submitted for the NB Power's IRP. The bottom left chart, it was part of the public consultations in which customers had four options, and they get to put their priorities where they want. And we'll notice that the largest bit of priorities from respondents was clean energy at 36.1%. Lowest rates was the second most important part at 32.8%. Customer options such as efficiency programs and ways to reduce energy was 16.5%, and debt repayment was the lowest at 14.5%. There was also another submission, a detailed submission to NB Power from the Energy Futures jury on the 2040 fuel mix, which is, if you look at the chart, is 95% carbon free. This is very similar, although the mix is not the same. The end result of what I submitted to them was a 95% renewable in-province generation mix. So it's really important for us to understand that New Brunswickers want clean energy, but we have to do it in a cost-effective way. So to the modeling objectives within the IRP. So the purpose of this modeling is to reasonably demonstrate using today's technology at today's cost, using today's energy rates, that New Brunswick can transition to a low carbon economy by investing the carbon tax into renewable energy, fuel switching technologies, and efficiency. The modeling shows this can be done at a lower cost than business as usual. So I have two objectives. One, I've coined the Stage 1 renewable portfolio. And this is essentially greening the grid, getting rid of the carbon out of the grid. So the objective of this renewable portfolio standard is to green the grid to a consumption of 95% renewable. The load from 2014-15 was used as a test year for comparison to business as usual. So by using the same load and using today's cost, it was really easy to make a really meaningful comparison to where we are right now and where we could be, given the same amount of energy sold and using the same energy patterns. Canada is starting from a very different place in the transition to a low-carbon economy than many other countries in the world, because our grid is already very, very low carbon. NB and Canada as a whole are already 75% carbon-free. So this stage is essentially complete. We're ready to do really the stage 2 piece. And the stage 2 is fuel shift, or the electrification of our economy. So that's moving all of our existing other fossil fuels energy over to electricity. And it has the object. Yeah.
Yeah, I just Susan just typed something in the chat. She's wondering where nuclear is in the chart.
There isn't any.
Referring to that.
Pardon?
Yeah. Oh, so she's typing again.
I think it might be useful to mark down your questions, and we'll do them at the end. Would that be?
Yeah. Okay. So she says okay.
Okay.
I have one request, Chris.
Yep. Yes.
I have one request. I'm not online, so could you let me know what page you're on?
Oh, okay. I'm on page 7, slide
Okay.
7. And the slide that the slides that I'm showing are slightly different. This is actually still in draft form, so I've been kind of working on it, but it's essentially the same. So slide 7.
Well,
I'll tell you when I go to a different slide, and I'll tell you what number.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome. Okay, so stage 2 renewable portfolio standard is again the electrification of all of the existing stuff. So things like our 2 other major sources of emissions are automotive and industrial. So switching all of these over to be on clean, green energy. So that's the objectives of the modeling. So here's a little graph, and I'm just going to read through the bottom part first, then we'll discuss the graph. So the fundamental issue of climate change is not really the amount of energy we use, but really the type of energy we use. It's actually impossible to solve climate change with efficiency, as that would require using zero energy, which is not really reasonable or equitable. The only credible solution to climate change is the transition of our energy needs to clean, green electricity. There's only really a need to conserve energy when there's a limited supply, like our fossil fuel-based energy systems and biofuels. It's also helpful to conserve in areas of high population density and jurisdictions that have significant load growth, which these don't really apply to New Brunswick. Developing countries that have, or their energy needs are growing really rapidly, efficiency really helps. In grids that are very carbon intensive, efficiency really helps quite a lot. In places where there's really high population densities, that really works. But in New Brunswick, for New Brunswick, there's really no practical or economical limitations to the amount of renewable energy available to us. We are blessed with abundant resources, and there are many times more renewable energy economically available to us than we could ever use. But even renewable energy and efficiency technologies have some environmental impacts, but these are minimal compared to the effects of climate change. The environmental impacts of all aspects of the transition to a low-carbon economy should be mitigated as much as possible. And this is back to the least cost environmental portion of sustainability. When you think about it, by not using our renewable energy available to us, we're wasting it. By not putting up a wind turbine, we're actually wasting that wind. Every day we don't invest in renewable energy, we're wasting it and spending our energy dollars on imported energy instead of using our own. It is common for people to associate using less electricity with carbon reductions, but this is not a direct correlation. The New Brunswick grid in Canada is overall already 75% carbon free. Using less electricity in our current grid has very limited effects on carbon reductions, and we'll look at that later in the slide. So because we're starting from a very different place than a lot of other jurisdictions in the world, our policies and plans really need to reflect that. So the graph above is the problem simplified, although this is not so simplified, it's actually quite detailed, but at a very high level. We look at the top red line, that's our current total energy use converted to megawatt hours per year. So I got that from Department of Energy. I think it was a few years ago, but that's our current total energy use, not just electricity, but all of our energy in New Brunswick. We look at the very bottom line, we'll see the brown line there. That's our current low carbon electrical energy. And then the purple line is our current total electrical energy. So we can see that a very small part of it is actually has any carbon into it. And then you can see the green line that comes up. That's us converting the rest of our fossil fuels to renewable energy. So we're starting from actually a very high point in the transition. And where that green line meets the blue line is the final total energy after energy efficiency. So there's a lot of efficiency gains in just transitioning to electrify our economy. Internal combustion engines are very inefficient. Boilers in themselves are only about 60 to 70% efficient, and using electricity to create that steam, industrial heat and steam, is quite efficient. What the graph really doesn't show is as in a business as usual scenario, our current total energy would be increasing by about probably 1% a year. So instead of a flat line, we're really dealing with growth, but it's not really big. So this plan itself estimates that the total final energy is about twice our current electricity demand, and I think that's a fairly reasonable place to be. It actually includes quite a bit of efficiency if you included the growth. We're looking at about probably a 60% efficiency gain in this whole plan out to about 2050 kind of area. So there's about a 60% efficiency gain kind of estimated within this plan. Again, when you model stuff, looking out to the future becomes a little bit more uncertain. The closer we are to now, the more certain we are. So that's really a kind of a really big picture of what we need to do, what the transition looks like, and really the main components of the transition. So there's the supply side and there's the demand side. So technical barriers. Are there any technical barriers to doing what we need to do? So no, there's really not. On the supply side, we have all kinds of different resources that we can use to supply. On the demand side, there's not really any technical barriers either. Most of our industrial emissions come from boilers. We can use electrode boilers to replace that with clean, green electricity. Our automotive sector, we have cars, trains, transports, buses, all kinds of things that we can do. There's really no technical barriers to 95%. So everything we need already exists, and for the most part is already lower in cost than business as usual. This is especially true for the things that we need to start doing immediately. The last 5 to 10% of emissions may be harder to displace, but we can be assured that technology will get better over time. And if the first 95% is less expensive, we can afford to have the last 5% more expensive. And that's the reason I set my goals to 95%, and it keeps us from a lot of the discussions that you have with people is the wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't shine all the time, and those things are really preventing us. And I think even in our government's mind, they're saying, oh, we're not ready for renewables. Well, maybe we're not quite ready for 100%, but we are ready for 95%. And if you set your goals to 95%, you don't have to have any of those arguments. So, good sense would dictate, let's do the first 95% first and deal with the final 95% later. The technologies and the costs associated with the last 5% are very uncertain right now. We don't know what technologies, we don't know where batteries will go. There's a lot of uncertainty in that, and we shouldn't be letting that last 5% preventing us from doing the first 95. Economic barriers, no. In the last several years, renewables have become... Pardon?
Yeah, sorry. I'm just going to interrupt you there. We're on slide 10 now.
Oh, slide 10, sorry. I forgot. So economic barriers, no. Renewables are less expensive. Here's 3 sources of data. The top left is from NB Power, and you can see the first 4 types of energy are all renewable energy, and they're cheaper. And then we get some gas, and you can see that for the most part, renewable energy is cheaper. I don't really agree with NB Power's numbers. They don't match reality, but even their own numbers showing that renewable energy is less expensive. The bottom slide, that's another very popular place to get costs. It's from Lazard. And we can see that, again, that the alternative energies are all cheaper than the conventional brands. And then the top right side, that's from the U.S. government energy information system. And these are using real-world costs. And again, renewables are cheaper or comparable to the alternatives. The cost and performance data that I used in all this modeling was actually from the U.S. government agency information. So it's NB Power stated that they don't have an issue with the costs that I'm using. This is a really quick slide. It just says, Warren Buffett, one of the richest guys in the world, thinks it's a good idea, and the rest of the world thinks it's a good idea. Why not NB Power? And this is just a screenshot of, I quickly Googled renewable energy and cost, and these are all the few of the many things that came up. And the reality is renewables are cheaper now. They're not more expensive. There's no reason that we shouldn't be doing it right now. And they're actually much cheaper than even just the fuel that goes into these plants and stuff now. So it's actually cheaper to build a new wind farm than to keep a coal plant running. We see on the left, Berkshire Hathaway, that's Warren Buffett. His utility is aiming for 100% renewable energy. Warren Buffett's not known to be an environmentalist. He's doing that because it's a good investment. We see the deals from Alberta get crazy low energy prices. Xcel, one of the largest utilities in the U.S., is to eliminate carbon emissions by 2050. This is the world we live in right now. It's cheaper. There's no excuse for us not to be doing this now. These two graphs, these are the investment details into the two renewable portfolio standards. So just look at the top one. So we've got 30% wind, 25% hydro. It's got 0% solar in there right now, but there's a reason for that, and I'll talk about it later. Geothermal, we actually have a really good geothermal resource in New Brunswick that could easily replace our nuclear reactor. 5% biofuels, 5% natural gas, and 5% from Hydro-Quebec. And there's also $1.6 billion, or 1.2, almost $1.3 billion worth of grid upgrades and storage and whatever else we might need to do. In this stage one, that would be to supply our current load. The stage two investment details we'll look at. So wind, because it's so low cost, we'll increase that to 41% of the share. That's 3,000 megawatts. That's really only 10 times what we have right now, and we don't really have very much right now. We probably have economically available to New Brunswick, probably about 7,000 or 8,000 megawatts. So it's actually not even really half of the available resources that we have. There are some new smaller hydro projects, some small ones, as well as the Grand Falls project, which we should be doing soon. The stage two investment details, I do have a fair amount of solar. And again, I'll talk about that a little late, about solar power later. Geothermal, it increases. So anyways, these are all essentially the investments. It looks at the capital cost, the fixed O&M cost, and the fuel cost. So all the real costs to these investments. So for the stage one financial details, because I used the exact same load and I'm using current prices, I can do a really good comparison of business as usual. So I picked the 2014-15 NB Power annual report to compare us to. I got the load data from NB Power, and I've created everything the same, but with a different energy mix. So we can see if we follow this plan, we can make $693 million a year net earnings as compared to the business as usual, which was $73 million. This is a really good investment for NB Power. Every other utility in the world is doing it. All you have to do is look at around New Brunswick's borders. On the other side of New Brunswick's borders, there's windmills. But we haven't put up any since 2009, I don't believe.
Sorry, you don't have to remind me of that, Chris. I can see them from my window.
Yeah, so I'm on slide 14 now. Sorry, I keep forgetting to talk about the slides. So slide 14. This is the stage 2 and what potentially NB Power could be making. Again, this is almost $1.2 billion. The amortization cost within this plan should be able to sustain itself. So potentially NB Power could be making that as a dividend payment almost every year to the province of New Brunswick. That's over 10% of our current budget, and it would go a long way to helping this province out. And it benefits all New Brunswickers, not just a few. So there are really many short-term, medium, and long-term benefits to this. You know, in the short term, we're going to get a lot of jobs and stuff out of the deal. We're going to immediately start reducing fuel and purchase power costs. You know, to the long-term benefits where NB Power is helping fund our social programs. I really can't think of any drawbacks to this. When I try and when I do my pros and cons list, I don't really come up with any cons, or not very many anyways. So the carbon tax. So we're in a situation now where we have current legislation. Our Climate Change Act came into effect last April. Many people don't know that we've had a carbon tax since then. But the federal government didn't approve it, and they're putting their own onto us. But because our current carbon tax didn't actually introduce a new cost to consumers, it was just using existing tax revenue to fund this Climate Change Act. They can coexist. There's no need to get rid of it, and I don't think we should, and I think we should be pressuring our government to leave it as is. That money is really important. So this modeling assumes approximately $370 million a year in carbon tax revenue. The current Provincial Climate Change Act can provide about $190 million of that per year through the recycling of existing tax revenue. And again, it's already in the budget. This is already within our budgets. And if you combine that with NB Power's already planning 2% rate increases essentially forever, and in around 2040, we're going to get a real shock, and I'll show you later. So if and a 2% rate increase for NB Power is actually equivalent to about $10 a ton. So we could actually easily justify these 2% rate increases as a way to satisfy the federal government. So that's where the money comes from. We can get it from the existing carbon tax fund, as well as a few, probably 5 years worth of 2% rate increases. The federal carbon tax plan is a market-based system. It's trying to change the markets by increasing one thing and hoping things will change. This is a regulated plan, and a regulated plan is much more certain in the end results, as it guarantees action and does not rely on the human nature of market-based systems, which are not always rational. There's a lot of things within a market, such as the fossil fuel industry lobby, that we're not always doing things that are economical within a market. And a really good example of that is renewables are cheaper now, and NB Power is not investing in them because they want to build a nuclear reactor that doesn't really exist. So a regulated plan guaranteeing this funding is much more certain than this market-based system of the federal government. And I don't really agree with the federal carbon plan, but the two can coexist. So this is the stage 1 investment plan, and this is the order that we go into things. So if we look to I'm on slide 16 now, sorry. So you look at the technology, so we get some hydro, which is the Grand Falls project, some small hydro, some wind, some natural gas, geothermal, bio, and it just essentially phases this all in. And so the next column is the accumulated megawatt hours. So we can see that keeps growing and growing and growing. The next column is the carbon tax revenue. The next one is the accumulated reinvestment. So that's the displaced cost from the cells, and we'll see that's growing faster and faster and faster. The next column is the total investments. Yeah.
Are you
Yes.
scraping something around on your desk or something?
Oh, maybe.
I think
Sorry. Sorry, I was not that. I'm a fidgeter. So that's the total investment. That's the capital investment that's made every year. And then I've got DSM investments. So you'll notice this plan really just models it's realistic, and it would actually be quite conservative. The DSM investments is just taking that capital cost out. It doesn't include any of the returns from those investments. And this part of the plan doesn't really, it assumes that our load stays the same over the 25 years, which is not realistic and very conservative as well. But we can see that we can start taking money back out of the fund through that DSM investments. That's essentially a dividend out of the system. So you can start taking money out of the fund to do other things, such as efficiency or other things that we'll talk about in a little bit later. So again, the technology type, then you get capacity factors, which is a major part of the investment. The capital cost per megawatt hours, or the in-service capital cost, fixed O&M cost, fuel cost, the capacity additions, total fixed O&M costs, total fuel costs.
Sorry, this is Susan. Hi, sorry about that. I see a couple people don't have their mics muted. Could you please mute your mic, because that sound of ripping paper or whatever is extremely distracting. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so then you get your fuel costs, generation, that's the megawatt hours created from each of the particular investments. Then the income investment, which is the displaced cost. And then there's the displaced cost I use at $49 per megawatt hour. That's about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And I got that information from NB Power. If we were to increase load, that number would be quite higher, and because of the exponential nature of this compounding effect, if you increase that even just a little bit, it grows really, really, really fast. So this is really conservative is what I'm trying to get at, I guess. So then you get your displaced cost, and you'll subtract your O&M cost. So as we put up windmills, it will create long-term jobs, and whatever technologies do have a fuel cost, I subtract that from it as well. So one of the main reasons this works really well with renewables is the scalability of them. We can do small projects that can be scaled to fit our budget. Big mega projects are very risky and often go over budget and schedule. Smaller projects can also be bought online fast and hence start reducing that fuel and purchase power faster. So again, one of the really, really good reasons why this works so well is scalability. We don't have to do these big mega projects that take up a lot of time and money and take a lot of time to come online. So I just talked about the displaced cost, and one of the reasons that this modeling is so complex is because I haven't been able to get NB Power to completely model this and provide it in a apples and apples comparison. But they have modeled a very similar plan to this several years ago, and they wouldn't give me the final results, but they did give me a model of the displaced cost. So the plan to displace all this cost was very similar to the one that we just looked at. And if you look at the two graphs, they're very similar. And this kind of proves that the modeling that I've done is the same as their really, really super sophisticated modeling. And that's one of the ways that you verify a model is you use other models, and if they come up with the same answer, you know you're doing stuff right. So some good verification that the methodology that I'm using is correct. So the plan itself is put together with some of the following principles. We spread the total investments over the planning period, so we don't have to do it all at once. We can do a little bit each year and create some sustainable industries. Focuses on the better investments first and better carbon reductions first. Due to the compounding nature of the economics behind this, if you do the better investments first, it grows faster. And then, so that's one of the reasons that you would do some of the better investments first. This plan, you notice, it only focuses on a few very mature technologies and spreads them out over time to create sustainable industries and allows for significant learning curves. So if we do these smaller projects, we can do really good learning curves. As we do a wind farm, the next time we do one, we'll be able to do it better. And if we spread that out over some time, we can really get behind a learning curve. Unlike big mega projects like La Pro and stuff, where it puts everybody to work for 3 or 4 years and then there's nothing for 30 years. And by the time we need to do it again, everybody's retired. So this type of economic planning works quite well. The beginning of the plan should be much more accurate. We should be really trying to get the first 3 to 4 years really written in stone what we need to do, and the 10 years, we can be really looking relatively stable of what we need to do. But things can and will change over time, so the last 10 to 15 years can easily be adjusted to account for changes in technology, cost, and experience. So again, kind of with my theme about the 95%, we should always keep that in mind, but know that things will change and we can change with it. This is a base case sensitivity analysis, and if you don't know what a sensitivity analysis is, it's used in modeling to look at the effects of changing different assumptions in the model. This analysis moves each of the major assumptions in the model up and down by 10% to show the effects, and will indicate which of the assumptions make the biggest difference. So some things you can change in the model and you can see that they make bigger differences than others. In addition to changing each assumption individually, I've also done a best and worst case scenario. The best case scenario looks at all of the assumptions moving in a 10% positive direction, and the worst case scenario looks at all of the assumptions moving in a negative scenario. The scenario approach is used to indicate the min and max range of the modeling. So if you look at this model, and it says the plan is most sensitive to demand and rates. So the amount of electricity that we sell has the largest effect. You can see that the difference from base case is $68 million, which is the biggest change of any of them except for rates. And the best worst case scenario doesn't move rates, though. It holds the rates. So we can notice that even under a worst case scenario, we can adjust our rates by 10% to get the same amount. So as far as modeling goes, we can never predict the future. We only can be confident in the future. So there's a really high level of confidence that NB Power can have net profits in the range of $514 million to $863 million to supply our current load with renewables while keeping energy rates low and stable. So, compared to business as usual as 73, even a worst case scenario is looking quite well. Oh. Next slide, slide 19. This is another type of sensitivity analysis that I did that looks at different energy mixes. So instead of just changing the assumptions and the mix staying the same, I just changed the mix. So I've got 3 here. I've got a gas mix, which is essentially all of our existing hydro, and the rest supplied with natural gas. I've got in the middle is the base case, the 95% renewable. And on the right, I've got a nuclear option in which I essentially replace the geothermal with nuclear. So I look at the costs. So we can see that the 95% renewable is the least cost, or most earnings, I guess. Rates and earnings are very much tied together. An increase in earnings could also just as easily be a drop in rates. Another sensitivity analysis, and this one was done by NB Power in their IRP. Their modeling does it a little bit differently. They've changed some assumptions and stuff in theirs, and it looks at rates instead of earnings. So here's a list of all of the sensitivity analysis that they've done, sorted from least rates, which in my modeling would be highest earnings. They're again very much related, and they're sorted. And the ones with green, their model chose to add renewables. So you can see in a lot of cases, it adds renewables. And we'll notice too that the ones with renewables, like the CO2 cap, it's actually less expensive. So their modeling is showing the same things as my modeling. And I just want to point out my previous sensitivity analysis that I said that demand or efficiency had the largest effect on net earnings. And you can see here it also has the largest effect on rates. As you can see, a high energy efficiency and an extreme energy efficiency affects rates the most. I think another important thing to really look at, well, the sensitivity analysis that I show, it does show that, gas is $40 million to $90 million, but it's actually quite small. So whatever mix that we do end up with and do want, for the most part, has very little effect. The difference between a really, really good plan, a really robust system that's exactly what we want, and another system, the difference in rates is probably only going to be 2 or 3 or 4%. It's actually not very much. Okay, next slide, slide 20.
Chris,
Finance.
I'll
Yep.
just want to draw your attention to the time. It is 8:30 now.
Oh, it is? Oh.
Yep. You can keep going, but I just wanted to make sure you were aware of what time it was.
Okay, sorry, because I wasn't looking at the time. And maybe we won't go through the whole thing, but I do want to go through this slide and probably a couple more. I can probably skip a few quite easily. Financing sensitivity analysis. And I think this is probably the most important decision that really any government needs to make in the transition to a low carbon economy. And I've done these sensitivity analysis that, let's say they're not NB Power owned wind farms, which most of them are not now. and say we do private financing and let private companies invest into our renewables, that has the largest effect on this plan. And we can see if we do private financing for all this stuff and privatize the generation side for NB Power, they stand to lose $500 million a year, and that's what's at stake signing long-term power purchase agreements. They're essentially P3 projects. They make the price go up, and it's taking away from net earnings from NB Power. It's cutting into their market. It's the worst possible thing that we could ever do, is letting private corporations invest into the energy of our future. The other sensitivity analysis that we did on the other side, the 80% debt financing, which is essentially debt financing, which is what we're doing right now. Because there's no debt created with any of this, this is all generated from the carbon tax and displaced cost. Debt financing also has a really big significant effect on net earnings, and we should be really trying to not debt finance. So it's essentially we get private investments or the banks making the money, and I'd like to see New Brunswickers make the money. Again, to the right, NB Power's analysis, they very much show, they're quite honest, that private financing costs more. So I don't know why they keep doing it. Electricity rates, again, really important to the transition. We need to keep them low, and I'll try and skip through some of this stuff. But I do want to point to the chart, the second graph down, and that's from NB Power, and it shows what our electricity rates are going to do. And you can see they're quite stable for quite a long time, and then we've got a really, really, really big jump coming up. And that's because they're not investing in themselves right now, and they keep deferring investments, and that's almost all of our generation retiring within 2 years, and that'll all have to be debt financed. And it's going to make our rates skyrocket if we don't do something about it now. Again, I won't go through all of this. You guys can.
That last point again, Chris. Sorry about that. I was kind of reading some close.
Okay. It's the second graph, and it shows under our NB Power's current plan what rates are going to be like. And can you see at the very end it jumps right up? I'm on slide 21.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, you can see where it jumps right up, and that's because NB Power's continuing deferring investments. If you look at their integrated resource plan, they're essentially doing nothing for the next 25 years and leaving everything to the very end, and it's going to be a huge capital cost all at once in 2 or 3 years. And the only way for us to do that will be to debt finance it, and it's going to make our rates skyrocket. This is what's called intergenerational inequity. We're essentially saying, screw our grandchildren. That's what's going on right there, and it's not fair. It's not good planning. It's not good. So NB Power's IRP, they've applied this efficiency first methodology to their IRP, and it's not doing them any good. If you look at the top right-hand corner, that's their integrated resource plan. Essentially doing nothing over the next years. We can see our emissions are going up, not down. And in 2010, when our current CEO took over, we used to measure least cost by rates. It was least cost rates, and you can see to the left, the second paragraph down, the very first IRP NB Power did, they approved this, and it was for a really good reason, because when you add efficiency into the mix, it reduces your revenue, but it makes rates go up. And they were very smart back in that day, and the Energy Utilities Board was smart to realize that this wasn't really fair. But when our new president came in, he didn't seem to understand that. And I really think there was really big misunderstanding of what the software was telling him, and I believe it was really a bad mistake. So NB Power is currently going, they're not investing in renewables, and they're subsidizing efficiency. So at the hearings last year, I asked a couple of questions about these efficiency subsidies. So I asked, what would happen if we cancel them? That's the only really way to tell the effect on something, is to look at it with and without. So these are the graphs, and these are supplied by NB Power. This isn't my modeling, this is NB Power's modeling. So I asked, what is the effect on net earnings for NB Power over the next 10 years from all of these efficiency subsidies? So from the economic sustainability. And it shows that NB Power is going to lose $700 million. That's a lot of money for a province that's broke and for a utility that's really, really struggling. Selling less power is not good for NB Power. And I asked them, we've been going down this route for 8 years when our current president took over. And I asked, so in 8 years ago when we started going down this reduce and shift demand program, did they know that they were going to lose $700 million? And their answer was no. And I think that's really irresponsible of NB Power to, not know the effect of net earnings on their business plan. Net earnings isn't everything, but it should at least be known. I think it's really irresponsible. So these efficiency subsidies that we're going through have right now are not good for NB Power. It's economic suicide, essentially. So if we look to the social sustainability, the social aspect of these efficiency subsidies, so because they're ratepayer funded, we're all paying for them through our rates. And as you've seen in the modeling, efficiency makes rates go up, which is what's happening. So with efficiency, you can say, well, rates are going up, but our bills are going down. So really one of the important things that needs to be asked is, who's benefiting from that? Is it being benefited across the population quite well? And the graph on the left, and NB Power actually didn't know this information. Again, like net earnings, they didn't know how many people were benefiting from it. And most of their programs, it's less than even 0.5%. It's less than 1%. So we're all paying for somebody else's upgrades and stuff. It's really not fair. And if you look to the way most of these programs work, is their incentives. So say you want to insulate your basement and it costs $4,000, you have to have your own $4,000 to invest. Then NB Power will give you back $2,000 of all of our money. So only rich people can participate in these. Low-income people cannot participate in these. If we look at new home energy savings program, we're giving up to $10,000 to somebody that's building a new home. We're subsidizing somebody's mortgage. They're not fair. We've got single moms, low-income people, all getting about a 6% rate increase, so that a guy that's working at Irving Oil can save 40% on his bill. And from a social sustainability point of view, these subsidies are not benefiting the right people. Efficiency subsidies from an environmental sustainability point of view, I asked, what is the effect on emissions if we canceled these programs? And this is it. It's less than 5%. The graph, we're on slide 25, by the way, sorry. On the bottom left, That's less than a 5% reduction in emissions over 25 years because our grid's so carbon free as it is. So from a sustainability lens, from an economic point of view, from a social point of view, and from an environmental point of view, these programs are not really benefiting anybody. They're essentially feel-good projects, and they're really preventing us from doing what we really need to be doing. So I'm not against efficiency. I want to be very, very, very clear that I'm not against efficiency. We should always be promoted. We should always respect the energy that we use. I think that we should do, this plan actually has probably more efficiency into it. It's just done in a different way that mitigates all these pitfalls of the current programs. They're fair and accessible to everyone, and they pass all three pillars of sustainability. So instead of doing efficiency subsidies, let's do efficiency investments. So here's a list of programs. I'm not going to go through them all because we're running out of time, but as far as say home efficiency, which I think is one of the big ones, let's do efficiency loans that are paid back via on-bill financing. So if you save $100, you pay $75 of that back to NB Power until it's paid off. That makes them accessible to everybody in New Brunswick. Because NB Power is allowed to earn a small return on these loans, say 5 or 6%, it doesn't affect them financially. Again, emissions, it's not going to do a whole lot. But if we do EV car incentives, for an example, might sound like a subsidy, but NB Power is going to sell the electricity that feeds them, so they can be designed so that the incentive to buy an electric car is paid back via the electricity sales. And all of these programs are here, and I've done a rough calculation on these investments. Instead of losing $700 million over the next 10 years, NB Power could actually earn close to $1.8 billion over the next 10 years by making efficiency investments rather than efficiency subsidies. Of New Brunswick, of all places, we should know that subsidies don't work. They only benefit a very few small amount of people. We need to stop it. Changing behavior. This talks about time of use pricing. I'm not going to read through it all, but really quickly, bottom graphs from Earth Hour last year in Ontario. We can see we dropped 218 megawatts, which is good, good concerted effort. But if you look at the generation mix in Ontario, they're very low carbon as well, but 95% carbon free. They curtailed wind power, didn't have any carbon reductions, didn't do anything. So a lot of these systems that we're developing to try and change behavior, they're not doing what we think they're doing. Financial risk management, because we're spending the money now and getting the fuel in the future, it really helps with financial risk. And again, you guys can read all through that. Smart grid, again, I've got some costs from the Pan-Canadian Wind Integration Study, some costs there. Emissions, just kind of the real reason I want to do all of this. My modeling, I can't model the emissions over time like NB Power, but I can do a comparison of the final emissions of the two renewable portfolios. And we can see that this plan will dramatically reduce emissions to where we need to be to meet our climate targets. This is supply versus demand. Essentially, this modeling that I've done, I've dispatched that generation mix at an hourly level over the entire year. I've used existing New Brunswick wind patterns and solar patterns and all that kind of stuff, and I dispatched it.
I've got to check out now, but I'm not feeling very well, and I'm just fading out quick. But I want to thank you for your presentation. It's been really good, and I'm looking forward to looking through the whole grant PowerPoint as well.
Yep.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'll
So.
stuff too, Chris. Thanks a lot.
Yep. Wind power, again, I didn't I didn't do all the modeling. There's other modeling here from the Pan-Canadian Wind Integration Study. They've come up with the same results that I have, essentially, again, confirming that what I'm saying is not out of line. One of the reasons wind is so good for New Brunswick, if you look to the second to the bottom graph on the left, the gray one, we'll see that wind power consistently produces more power in the winter than it does the summer, which is really good for us. That's what we want because we use more power in the winter. I won't go through the whole slide. Geothermal. Geothermal can easily replace nuclear. These are two geothermal maps. And if you'll notice, southern New Brunswick actually has probably the best geothermal resource in all of eastern North America. We've got a really good resource, and we should really be looking to see if we can use that. It's a really good baseload power that could easily replace our nuclear reactor much cheaper. Hydro-Quebec. Hydro-Quebec currently has 140 terawatt hours of energy stored in their dams. It's enough to power New Brunswick for 10 years. We should really be using that. Again, back to just displacing the fuels and not the plants themselves. I asked MB Power if we could run Beldoon seasonally, not run it in the summer, replace it with Hydro-Quebec. MB Power could reduce their emissions this year without building anything by about a third. For the additional cost of that's about $23 million, which to me and you might sound like a lot of money, but MB Power's revenue requirement is about $1.8 billion. It's less than a 2% rate increase. It's really irresponsible of us not to do this in the face of climate change. Anyways, and we've got a new government in Quebec, and they want to sell power really, really, really bad. And we should be building power lines, not pipelines. In-province hydro, this model does account for the refurbishment of Mactaquac and the Grand Falls project. Biomass, again, it is a limited resource. We should only use it a little bit, and again, you can just use it seasonally in the wintertime. Fossil fuels, again, this is why I go to 95%, and by keeping the fossil fuel plants around, notice that it has in the investment details, it's got the largest portion of capacity at 1,600 megawatts. That's the largest piece in its firm capacity that we can turn on and off whenever we want. But if we look to the total capital cost for it, it's the smallest. It provides the most capital, but at the smallest cost, because fossil fuel plants are actually quite cheap to build. The expensive part is the fuel that goes into them. So if you don't plan on burning a lot of fuel into them, they're quite inexpensive. And to staff these plants, look, it's $10 million. That's, again, a really small price compared to the $1.8 billion revenue requirement they have. And that's why I stick with the 95% renewable currently. When we get to the last 5%, we can look at technologies like hydrogen or renewable natural gas or outfitting them with carbon capture. There are technologies available. The costs are still quite high, but I don't think we need to do those now. We can wait till later and we can assess what's the most cost-effective way to get rid of that last 5% when we get close to that. Solar. So there is solar in my stage 1 modeling. I know the Conservation Council has recommended 200 megawatts of residential solar, and that essentially is in this plan. This modeling is from MB Power's point of view, though, and residential solar is behind the meter. So it's really just reduced load for NB Power. It's reduced demand, and so that's really taken into account already. For the stage 2 renewable portfolio, I do include a fair amount of solar. I think as we get to that stage, we'll have hotter summers, we'll have a bigger load, it'll be much easier to integrate it. So the reason I don't put a lot of solar in the beginning, and if you just look at the bottom graph, the blue line is our actual demand monthly over the season. And then I take wind and I just scale it up to be 100% of our energy use, and I take a solar profile from New Brunswick and I scale it up. And we'll notice the wind really closely matches our demand profile, whereas solar is actually opposite. Large amounts of solar right now would end up just displacing other renewables. It would have very little carbon reduction. So that's why I've done the modeling the way that it is right now. But we can have residential solar, and MB Power can do the Solar City business model where they lease solar panels to people, and that will really, it's good business sense for them. It's good for Solar City. It should be good for MB Power. Nuclear power. It's not safe, not green, not cheap, not available, not needed. Nuclear power, no thanks. So that is the end of my presentation, everybody.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So, oh, I'm hearing myself back. Someone's got to mute. Okay. So, yeah, I think maybe we'll just, do you want to take a couple questions, Chris, if there are any? There's a few people left.
I have a couple questions, and I guess I have a couple questions for you guys as well, I guess. But I'll take your guys' questions first.
So does anyone have any questions for Chris?
My question, this is Sam, if you can hear me.
Hi, Sam.
I noticed in some of the slides that natural gas is listed a number of times, and I don't understand that. Natural gas is it seems to be a fairly small percentage of the resources that we're using.
Yeah. Here, I'll just bring it up. So essentially the wind doesn't blow all the time, and the sun doesn't shine all the time. And if we want to get to 100% without fossil fuels, it gets quite hard, especially with current technology. So if you have a natural gas plant that's not running 95% of the time, it produces very little emissions. Pardon?
I think that was just some feedback there. Yeah.
So, and we don't save a lot of money by getting rid of it. This is, in my modeling, I've incorporated all new facilities. I don't think we actually probably even really, we can probably reuse some of the existing ones, probably some refurbishments. We would need some new ones. Some of our older ones are not super flexible to be able to do what they need to do. But again, capacity doesn't emit CO2. Only running them emits carbon. So very similar. I have a gas generator in my basement that I use when the power goes out, and I don't think twice about it. And That's kind of the same principle that this modeling uses, that it keeps it around just in case.
But natural gas is a very high impact as far as climate change is concerned. It's very potent in methane release, and that's one of the things that is affecting global change, global warming, is all this natural gas that's being
Yes.
mined.
Yes, that's why we use very, very little natural gas. Very, very small amounts. And we will get rid of it at the end. You know, my plan is to not just get to 95% and quit. I guess my thoughts is that's the last 5% that we need to do. If we look at the emissions created from these plants, it's quite small, and we will get rid of that part as well. It's a transition, Sam. So we need to transition. It's not going to go to 100% tomorrow. So
you're not talking about building more or developing more natural gas then?
No, I don't think we should develop any of our own. I think we have, if you look at the infrastructure that's already in place in New Brunswick, we've got the LNG things there, and that's a really good storage place, and we could fill those up every 3 years, and that would probably be enough kind of thing. No, I'm not suggesting that we develop any of our own, and what we do use, we use it very, very sparingly, and it will be phased out at the very end.
So, Chris, Susan has a question there in the chat. I don't know if you can see that.
Oh, I'll have a look here.
Do you want me to read it to you, or?
Read it for me.
Oh, sorry.
Okay,
Susan, she's asking, she says, nuclear doesn't fit into your model, but clearly fits with NV Power's model for the next while. Does your model require LaPro to go offline immediately? And what's the cost of building a geothermal plant to replace LaPro? She's wondering about feasibility.
Oh, feasibility. Nuclear's much cheaper, significantly cheaper. No, I think we should phase nuclear power out. I think climate change is a really big deal. I don't think currently, right now, if we shut down Point LaPro, it would probably put the province into bankruptcy because NB Power is 95% in debt. If we shut that down, we'd have to write that off, and NB Power would owe more than it's worth, and that would severely affect our credit rating. I think we should plan maybe for an earlier retirement of it. Probably for planning purposes, we would expect to see it go off around 2030, even though its lifespan is to 2040. It's essentially an experiment. It never goes quite as well as what they say it does. So from a planning perspective, we would expect it to go off around 2030. Maybe it can stay on a little longer, maybe not. Unless something fairly significantly safety-wise comes up, then we should shut it down immediately.
Okay, great. So, Chris, did you? She says thanks there. Did you say you had some questions for everyone?
Yeah. So this is still in draft form. I haven't really publicly released this yet. Kind of getting some feedback. So if anybody's got any feedback, I'd certainly appreciate it. Also, I'm also looking for support for this. One guy, I don't have a lot of time to promote this as much as possible. I would like to know if there's any barriers to possibly any of these groups accepting this as something that we can all be asking for, I guess. I think it's generally what we're all looking for. So I guess I'm looking for feedback, and I'm also looking for support.
Okay, great.
And it's something you don't have to answer now, but I would appreciate it if everybody thought about it. Because and again, if you don't want to support it, let me know why. I guess some of the things within this modeling are easy to change, and I am willing to change. And this is quite a lot different than what I first came up with 4 years ago, based on a lot of feedback. So again, if there's any barriers to anybody supporting it, I'd like to hear them as well.
Okay, great. And Susan also commented there that Rowan, who had to leave a bit ago, is going to follow up with you, Chris.
Okay, that would be great.
And I'll put it too as an item on our next low carbon caucus call, which hopefully I'll get around to organizing next week. And so, Chris, I don't know if you would want to join that call, or I could just give you an update following it of what, kind of want to go with it.
When is it next? I'm really busy for the next several weeks. I'm going to Australia.
Okay. Yeah, I could
I'm going to be away.
I'll just keep you updated.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much. This was really interesting evening. So thanks a lot, Chris, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you very much, everybody. Okay, bye.
Good night.